Yes, I'd like to nominate Councillor McAlpine.
Councillor McAlpine, do you accept the nomination?
I do. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other nominations for the position of chair?
Move to be closed.
Okay. Seconder for closing?
Second.
All those in favor of closing nominations? Okay, opposed? Congratulations, Councillor McAlpine. I will now call for the position of Vice Chair of the Policy Development and Strategic Direction Committee. Councillor Bell?
Yeah, I nominate Councillor Howes.
Councillor Howes, do you accept?
Sure.
Do I have any other nominations for the position of Vice Chair? Seeing none, can I get a motion to close nominations? Councillor Pierce and Councillor Chambers, all those in favor? Okay, motion's carried, and I'll turn it over to Councillor McAlpine.
Thank you very much. Could I have the approval of the agenda? If there's any additions. Moved by Mayor Bailey, second by Councillor Coleman. All in favor? Okay, motion passed. Is there declarations of pecuniary interests? Okay, seeing none. So we go to delegations, petitions, and presentations. Do we have any more than on the list? Okay. I guess we'll ask for Melinda Monroe, Integrity Commissioner, review of annual report and recommended changes of code of conduct. You have the floor, Melinda.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I heard a just sort of one word and I wasn't sure what that, whether it was directed at me. So good evening, everyone. Thank you, Councillor McAlpine. So I was invited tonight I had understood that you had read my annual report and my comments on the Collingwood inquiry, and that you wanted to have me back to ask some questions about that, or to debate a bit about whether you think some of my suggestions for amendments to your code of conduct might be useful. And then I was also asked if I might provide some direction on Zoom meetings and email meetings or email conversations. So I've made some notes about those two things. I haven't prepared a formal piece of guidance for you pending our conversation tonight. And if you after tonight, if you need that, then I will turn my notes into some direct guidance for you that you can have along with the other guidance I've done for you in the past. So I guess my question to you is, what would you like to do to begin? Would you like to just start asking me questions about my report and about the Collingwood inquiry and what people were thinking about that?
Joan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would suggest that perhaps Melinda could give us an overview of what she thinks is most important in her report, including the Collingwood inquiry. That's just my suggestion. Thank you.
Do we have any other comments? So would that be okay, Melinda? Just give us a quick overview then of your report.
For sure, I'm happy to do that. Very happy indeed. So I've been your Integrity Commissioner since 2016, and this is the first renewal. So we had I was appointed for 3 years and then renewed for an additional 2 years, and this is the last part of that 2 years. So one of the things I note in the report that you'll need to do sometime this year is decide how you're going to proceed when you issue either an RFP, you renew me, or you issue an RFP for a new Integrity Commissioner. So that's something I was just highlighting for you in the report. Since 2020, there haven't been any complaints. I've had a few calls from councillors, which I made a few notes of, very minor issues, just providing advice as needed by councillors who are asking questions. It's been a much calmer council than we might have had in the past. And so you haven't kept me very busy at all. I issued some guidance for you with respect to the Emergency Act that the province passed, and all it did was extend the timelines. That's all been repealed, so that's no longer an issue for you. And I don't believe that they have extended those timelines again under the new stay-at-home orders. So the main thing that I wanted to do with my report then, given that there was very little to report on in terms of actual complaints or issues arising, was the Collingwood inquiry was released this year, and there were a number of things that Mr. Justice Morocco talked about that suggested that there might be some tweaks that could be made to the Brant County Code of Conduct if you want it. I mean, he has his what has happened as a consequence of his ruling is that the province, as you know, has decided to look at some of the issues relating to integrity commissioners. Excuse me, in particular, whether integrity commissioners should have a broader range of penalties they can recommend, or whether they should be able to recommend just issue penalties without going back to council. But all of that is in very, very, very preliminary stages. So these things are mostly uncontroversial, but were just forms of best practice that might be useful to apply on Brant. So you may recall, if you followed along with the Collingwood inquiry, it was a rather big scandal in which the CAO and the mayor were involved in some very serious conflicts of interest that resulted in friends and colleagues making money off the sale of a utility and then using some of the money to build a recreation facility. And hopefully that doesn't happen very often throughout the province. So that was hopefully just a one-off. But Mr. Justice Morocco used it as an opportunity to talk about what he identified as issues in the municipal law and also in the accountability provisions in the municipal act, like the Integrity Commissioner, Auditors General, etc. So the first one that I noted that he had noted was that there's this confusion about the mayor being described as a CEO, and what does that actually mean? And that perhaps what was happening in Collingwood was that the mayor, as perceiving himself as like a CEO of a corporation, had the authority to sign contracts on behalf of the township without the permission of the council or the full approval of the council. And then he noted that the mayor does not have that role. The mayor is simply the first amongst equals, and has really very limited authority without having the council vote to support what they're doing. So there's no recommended changes that need to happen in the code of conduct. I just pointed out that if you have a delegation of authority bylaw and there's any possible ambiguity about the rights of the mayor, that might be something you would turn your mind to, but it's not a code of conduct issue. He also made a number of recommendations with respect to the relationship of councillors to staff. Our code of conduct, your code of conduct, is already very good in that regard in terms of directing the council. You are not to be directing staff. You have to protect the professionalism and the neutrality of the staff. So that's all very good. However, one of the things that Mr. Justice Morocco recommended with respect to councillors was additional transparency around things like gifts. And so that's one of the things I've suggested in the code of conduct is something like I've highlighted having a gifts registry. So once a year, everybody on council has to list the gifts that they receive. Or once a year, the councillor should have a disclosure of all of your financial interests so that the public can see all of the things that you own, and they're able to decide if you're in a conflict of interest. So these are things that he had recommended. It's not currently required in your code of conduct, but if you wanted to be more transparent, those would be a couple of options you might choose. One of the things I did recommend that you do is expand the definition of related person. So the definition of related person in the code of conduct currently is quite narrow. And he recommended the expansion of that, and that's in relation to all of this web of sisters and brothers-in-law and friends and things that were going on in the Collingwood situation. So expanding your definition of code of conduct to include aunts and uncles and cousins and nieces and siblings and grandchildren, to make it even a bit broader so that it's clearer for the public what a conflict of interest is in the Brant County Council. So that's one of the ones that I have suggested that is a fairly straightforward one to do. a few years ago, or sorry, rather in February, I issued some guidance to you about the difference between disqualifying and a non-disqualifying conflict of interest. So this is an interesting topic where the public perceives conflict of interest as bigger than the law. So the law basically says conflict of interest is just a financial conflict. If you are going to make money off a decision of council, or you potentially could lose money off a decision of council, then that's a conflict of interest. And that's what's clear in the law. The public, they think that if you're making a decision that, you know, is going to make your golf course nicer, or is going to improve your view, or things like that, then they think that might be a conflict of interest, and they get all upset about that, and properly so. I mean, those things do affect people's decision making. So in the Collingwood decision, Justice Morocco actually reflected the same guidance that I had provided for you, which is guidance that most integrity commissioners provide for their municipalities, which is to create this distinction between a disqualifying conflict of interest and a non-disqualifying one. So disqualifying is anything under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. Financial conflicts, you're disqualified from voting, you have to leave the room. But a non-disqualifying conflict is one of those ones where, and I get these calls from time to time from councillors that say, the public are kind of upset with me because my favorite restaurant is going to get a zoning exemption and they think I'm getting some kind of a benefit from it. And but that's not really a conflict of interest. And I would say, no, that's correct. It's not a conflict of interest. But when we call it a non-disqualifying, it might be a situation where you say, but I'm going to declare that, and I'm going to explain to council why I don't think this is disqualifying. And then we're going to proceed, and I'm going to vote as I would ordinarily do. And the public then has something to say, oh, okay, we understand why this is non-disqualifying. So I issued you some guidance on that in February. And so the recommendation from Justice Morocco was perhaps codes of conduct should actually have that language right in their codes. And so we could very easily do that if you wanted that, is to put that the same language in that guidance that I gave you last year. And then the other issue that was sort of highlighted in my report on page 5 was that he was also interested in thinking about the role of the Integrity Commissioner. And so he made a series of recommendations, and I'm not making any recommendation about them because some of them affect me. So it would be not appropriate for me to tell you what to do, certainly for you to decide if you wanted to. So for example, he suggested that integrity commissioners should only have a single non-renewable term. So you have me for 5 years, and then I can't come back. You have to get someone different. And that would be unusual, but certainly it's something that he thought might be appropriate. That way the integrity commissioner doesn't become all buddy-buddy with the council and the councillors. He recommended that the integrity commissioner report only to council as a whole, which I already do, and that's already in the agreement and in the code. Recommendation that the removal of the integrity commissioner require 2/3 majority vote. So should you decide to fire me or fire your integrity commissioner, you would have to have a special majority. And that makes sense to me, but that's up to you to choose if you're interested in doing that. He recommended that the integrity commissioner should have a dedicated website, provided by the municipality that has all of the guidance documents and any training materials and the codes of conduct and how to submit a complaint as separate from everything else. So separate from the clerk's office or the CAO's office or the councillors. I think that's just for ease of access for people as opposed to anything particularly to do with propriety. He recommended that they consider having an external auditor review the operations of the integrity commissioner. That's up to you if you thought that would be appropriate to review my practice, my files, my billing, presumably. And then finally, that integrity commissioner should be supported to participate in the Municipal Integrity Commissioners Association. And I've been participating with them now for a few years. It's not all, but most of the integrity commissioners in Ontario, and we share best practices. We have a code of conduct of our own, and we recently have started posting decisions to Canley so that other integrity commissioners we can rely on each other's decisions, and we can start to balance between municipalities so that one municipality isn't, integrity commissioners isn't recommending much higher penalties than another one. They're starting to sort of balance out based on our collective experience. So any of those might be things that you might want to consider. Some of them would go in the contract with the Integrity Commissioner, and some of them would go in the code. And then there were the ones that I recommend that you should include in your code of conduct that are fairly straightforward. Start on page 8. And they're very simple, really. One is just a further suggestion that you reflect on your potential codes of conduct and call me if you need help. And obviously in the code, if you ask for my advice and I give that to you in writing, then I can't come back and find against you later. So it's always good for you to come and ask me. Adding a sentence to a section on gifts that just explains why gifts are a problem. And so it doesn't really change the meaning. It just is more clear about why it's a problem to accept a gift or hospitality. Adding another section that simply makes it clear that you cannot accept a gift from anyone at any time if they're in the middle of a procurement process. So while you might be able to accept a dinner from a colleague, if that colleague is participating in a procurement process, you may not accept any gift from them. Adding a sentence to the section about information that simply extends your obligation to hold confidential information as confidential, even after you're no longer in office. And then just a couple of the relationship issues around the Integrity Commissioner. One is clarifying that I report to the council. One is about removing me only by special majority. And then I put in the 31.2, which would be if you wanted to say your appointments are only going to be for a limited number of years, renewable or non-renewable. And then the other items that I've already mentioned, I've identified, and I haven't put them in the draft, but they're things you might want to consider. So an annual sign off by the members to prove you're aware of the code of conduct, expanding the definition of related person, which we talked about, expanding the gifts and benefits to require a gifts and benefits registry, and also maybe a section to talk about whether appearing at a charity event should be treated as a gift. Requiring annual disclosures of financial interests. One of the things that Justice Marco talked about and others have talked about is the possibility of putting some kind of an exclusion on councillors to say that you cannot apply for a job with the county immediately after your term of office ends. You might want to consider possibly doing that. And then the final thing was Justice Marco talked a little bit about this, and some integrity commissioners do it. I'm a little bit less hands-on, as you will know. Some of my integrity commissioner colleagues are very, very involved with their councillors and doing all kinds of training and individual meetings, and they see themselves as kind of coaches. And I see myself a bit more as sort of the last resort if you're not able to manage things yourselves. And so these items were things like requiring training every year, requiring that I meet individually with every one of you each year to talk about whatever issues are coming up. And even he talks about the possibility of requiring training for people who are running for county council. So anyone who posts that they want to run would have to have integrity commissioner training or code of conduct training. So there's a lot in there to discuss. And the question to you was, to what extent do you think those things are necessary? And I've given you a bit of a draft code in which I had put in really the more of the minor things, or the sort of the housekeeping, if you will, matters. And then any of the bigger, more complicated ones, I've left to your discretion to ask, say, if you want to have them, you want to have a debate on them, or how you would like to proceed.
Open it up for questions from council. Councillor Dave Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I got a few questions. I guess I'll just work through them one at a time, if that's okay.
Yep.
First question, that annual financial disclosure statement. I mean, you're talking to somebody that has a hard time just getting their annual taxes done. So how much is involved in that? I guess, does that all depend on how much you own, I suppose, or is it a one page, or what's, I don't even know what's involved with that.
Right. I mean, it can be as detailed or as simple as you would like it to be, but I expect it's going to be kind of perhaps similar to a statement of assets. You know, what companies do you own shares in? What businesses do you own or have some kind of an ownership interest in, and what property that you own?
Okay, fair enough. Thanks. You talk about declaring or dividing up non-pecuniary conflicts between disqualifying versus non-disqualifying. And that's just for non-pecuniary, to be clear. If it's a pecuniary, you're out of
It's
the discussion.
it's automatically disqualifying.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this is, yeah, do you not think that might be a little bit confusing to the public? Like,
I mean, it could be. I mean, it would take a bit of, people getting used to the idea of what it means. It's meant to help the public in that the public are already saying, geez, that Councillor Miller, doesn't he always golf with Fred Smith? And now Fred Smith's going for a rezoning. And if you were to declare a non-disqualifying interest, what you would say is, yes, that, Fred Smith's my best friend and I do go golfing with him, but I can disabuse myself of that relationship and I'm perfectly happy to decide against him on a rezoning if that's what's appropriate. And then it would be for the public to then be able to say, well, do we believe you or not believe you? And they're not going to be able to intervene, but you're at least being transparent with them about something they're already probably worried about.
Okay. I mean, we could do that anyways without putting that in our code of conduct, but I see what you're saying, just trying to make it a formal process. And then my last question, that what went on in Collingwood? Like, sometimes we put these rules in and it's like, well, really, we're putting in common sense rules, they should have known. So I guess looking at it through our code of conduct, and maybe this isn't a fair question, but do you think that something like that could have gone on in the county of Brant with our current code of conduct? Like, would we not be violating something in there now? I put you on the spot there a bit, but
you absolutely would be violating not only it but the law, and that was also true in Collingwood. And so,
okay.
I hear your question, and I actually have some similar feelings in the sense that I once wrote an article for a law journal that was titled, "You Can't Legislate Good Faith."
Yeah.
Either people are honest or they're not honest. And making a law that says dishonest people must be honest isn't going to make the dishonest people honest, right?
Yeah.
What I think that Justice Morocco was trying to get at in a number of his recommendations, and he went on for several volumes, I think it was 7 volumes of his report, was what he was trying to say was that not only must you have the rules in place and have them be clear and so people can't wiggle out of them, but that you must also have a culture in the organization that says, if I see something, I say something. So that when the CAO in the initial case realized that things were going wrong, then it was up to them to do something, not just to go, oh, well, the council's telling me I have to do this and I have to just do it. Or when staff people would see things and think, well, this is not, you're not allowed to go around this procurement process. Like, one of the things that happened was they simply sole sourced things that should have gone through a formal procurement process. So a number of his recommendations are about, these are only a few of his recommendations, a whole volume, I think, on just procurement policy and the ethics of procurement. And what he was trying to say with the code of conduct things about procurement, about not accepting gifts and extending who a related person was trying to say to the councillors, get your mitts off the procurement process. And so I think yes, it could happen in Brant if your culture was one in which people believed that a councillor and the CAO, or a councillor and some senior official, were in collusion, and people around them didn't feel they had the authority or they were afraid to speak up. So I think that these amendments are, as I mentioned, most of them are kind of housekeeping, a little bit of additional transparency, but nothing, no kind of overhaul, because I think your code of conduct would, if everyone follows it, absolutely prevent the Collingwood situation from happening.
Okay, I appreciate the answer, and I'll stop there. But I just want to say I appreciate the service you've provided for us. I know personally you've always been very helpful for me and very responsive, like timely in your responses. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Councillor.
Councillor Ferrier.
Thank you, Chair McAlpine. Melinda, this is to you through the chair. And I echo Councillor Miller's statements. I know I've called you a few times over the years just to double check or triple check my own thoughts and feelings about some things, and just to make sure. And you've always been very responsive and responsible, and I appreciate that. My question isn't so much on the day-to-day piece, and it's not something we've really had to deal with on this term of council. Because I think we're actually very careful. I even know of some counselors who, you know, if a neighbor has an issue, we direct them to the other counselor for the ward so that there isn't the appearance of a conflict of interest. But the way it stands right now, unless I'm mistaken, you know, you can, if you were to find somebody on our council guilty of a breach, an ethical breach, you can only really make a recommendation of what you think the penalty is, and then we as the council have to vote on the penalty. And to me, that almost, I know it isn't technically, but it almost feels like that's a conflict of interest to vote on our colleagues' punishments that may or may not happen. And, you know, leaning many different ways. And I'd find it personally very hard to, again, with somebody I work with so closely and people I work with so closely, to not have some form of internal conflict, if not a conflict of interest. So could you speak a little bit more about the options that are possibly coming down the pike when it comes to those penalties being decided, maybe not by council, but by you or somebody in your position? I know you brought it up briefly, but I'm wondering if you could add a little more color to that.
Right. So some of the things that are being kind of mooted, if you will, by the province, and also AMO recently did a submission on it. And so AMO being the body that represents the elected officials, and then OMA is the one that represents the CAOs or the administrators at that level. So AMO had mooted a bit of it as well. So some of the things are whether or not the integrity commissioner should, so if I decide that someone should get a 90-day suspension of pay, that would be my recommendation, that I would actually be able to just order that. Like, it would simply be, the council wouldn't have the right to not accept that recommendation or not act on that. So that those penalties they would come straight from me. So that's one of, and AMO is of the view, and the integrity commissioners, the municipal integrity commissioners of Ontario, are both of the view that we're not the elected officials, right? You are the ones who are elected, and you're the ones who have the responsibility under the sort of parliamentary law and parliamentary procedure to manage your chamber and to manage your relationships with one another. And so who am I, some person who may or may not even live in the community, and maybe you hire an integrity commissioner that's really strict, and maybe you hire one that's not so strict, and there's issues of fairness as between one community and the other. If the integrity commissioner, and to whom are we accountable? So we have sort of tried to be a bit hands-off with that and say we'd rather leave it with you as the elected officials to use your responsibility to manage that political relationship. So that would be my view as well. However, if the province came down and said I had to do it, I would do it. One of the other recommendations, or the things that's being debated, is should the integrity commissioner have a broader range of things that can be recommended. So currently in the Act, essentially all the integrity commissioner can do is recommend a penalty. We can't recommend things like an apology. Quite often we do. And then the councillors, you can kind of in your broad elected authority order those things, or and you can put it in your code of conduct that you would like those kinds of things. But the Act itself doesn't allow for any kind of remedial action except a penalty. So they're talking about, should they broaden that amount, the remedial things that could be done, that the integrity commissioner can ask for an apology, or the integrity commissioner can, like we look at situations like Sarnia, where the integrity commissioner could recommend or that the mayor's office be locked, so they can't get into the building where the staff are, and things like that are quite extreme. And then the third thing that the province is mooting about this is about the removal of a councillor from office. And you'll recall this kind of ties back into what happened with Mayor Ford. And so one of the recommendations that they're debating is whether or not, like the MCIA, that if the thing that happened was so serious, I could, as integrity commissioner, apply to a court to have a judge remove a councillor from office because of the nature of the offense. And that's partly coming out of what's happened in Ottawa with the very serious allegations and the integrity commissioner's findings about sexual abuse of the staff. And so the province is saying, well, should the integrity commissioner, like under the conflicts of interest, have the ability to go to court and remove a councillor from office. And we're also, the municipal integrity commissioners are kind of a bit hands off about that because it's a huge responsibility. It's already a big responsibility of the MCIA. If we were to take steps under the MCIA and go to court, it's very expensive. It's very confrontational. And again, it comes under you're elected. The public elected you to do these jobs. They didn't elect me. So is it am I the one who gets to decide who represents democracy in the county of Brant? So that's what's being debated, and you'll probably see more about it. And if you would like, I can summarize the AMO materials and provide you with some notes about what's going on, because you may want to, as a council or even as a town or as a county rather, consider whether you want to make a submission when the public submissions period opens.
Thank you.
Is there any further questions? Okay, seeing none, is there a recommendation from the committee? Joan? Councillor Gatward? You're on mute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, it's been quite an interesting review, and thank you, Melinda. I know there's some items in here that I would like to see added to our code of conduct, and I don't know that all the items should be, but I think it would be a good idea for council to discuss the various recommendations and bring forward the ones to you in an ask to change our conflict guidelines. I like some of them, and some of them maybe aren't necessary. I think that we appointed you originally for 2 years and then reappointed you for another 2. Is that correct?
3 and 2.
3 and 2. So you're coming up to 5 years. I don't like, well, I can see where perhaps your point about becoming buddy-buddy with councillors could happen. I don't feel that would happen with you, but if we had to call for request for proposal for a new integrity commissioner, would you, under the guidelines from your association, reapply to Brant County? Or do you prefer, rather than doing that, if we reappointed you? And I don't know what council's going to decide, but I'm just thinking out loud here.
Well, certainly I would be happy to serve again as your integrity commissioner. And as much as that would be so lovely to not have to bid on an RFP, I think there's some merit in actually having a, I believe in the competition and procurement. And so unless you were to decide for some reason you didn't think it was necessary, then I think there's value in actually having a competitive procurement and make me prove that I'm as good as whoever else might apply.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Wee?
Aaron?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe you asked if someone had a recommendation. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
And I'll move that the presenter's report be presented as written. Be accepted as written.
Okay.
Seeking a seconder.
We have a second. Second by Steve Howes. Okay, all in favor?
Are you going to ask for
Mr.
questions?
Chair, do we get time to discuss?
Questions.
Sorry, okay, questions. Robert? Councillor Chambers?
Yeah, John, I don't understand the resolution. Is that to basically to receive it, or is that to put in place all of the recommendations that the Integrity Commissioner has made?
If you're asking me, Councillor Chambers, The motion is to receive it as written.
To receive it, not necessarily incorporate all of the suggestions that she has made.
That's correct.
Okay.
The motion is to receive it.
Then, Mr. Chairman, if I
Councillor
might,
Chambers?
if I might speak to the recommendation, I will support receiving the report. It's just, philosophically, you can get buried in codes of conduct and never be seen again, I think. The commissioner had made a statement that you can't legislate good behavior. And my view of the code of conduct is it's a guideline for good behavior. And not only is it a guideline for good behavior, it establishes a mechanism for a remedy if you don't behave. And that mechanism is spelled out through a process whereby people identify parts of the code of conduct that have been violated. And then there's the opportunity for to hear both sides and for an investigation that the integrity commissioner makes. So I look at the integrity commissioner as an investigator. I don't look at the integrity commissioner as a judge. I think the judge should be the council. But councils need investigators with a guideline to carry out an investigation, and that's what the code of conduct is. Getting back to the first thing I said, which is you can't legislate good behavior. The code of conduct, in my opinion, can't be so fine and scripted that it takes the place of common sense. And I think our present code of conduct is a good balance of common sense and prescriptive behavior. Things like conflict of interest, things like pecuniary interest. We've always had those issues, and we've always made judgments where we have sought guidance. And I think that's another role of the integrity commissioner if you're unsure. So I think we have a few housekeeping issues that the integrity commissioner has recognized that we should institute. But as far as major overhaul and adding another layer of guidelines for behavior, I would like a further discussion on that, because I'm not really sold on legislating behavior. I'm more sold on using common sense. So those are my comments, and I don't know where we go from here once we receive it. I think there may be an additional exercise where we do the housekeeping things, and perhaps staff can give a draft revision incorporating things that are suggested in housekeeping manners and slight changes. So that's my comments, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Laferriere?
Yeah, thank you. Sort of incorporating Robert's piece there, just because I do worry that it could get sort of lost in the weeds. We have an integrity commissioner. We have the integrity commissioner write a report with a lot of ideas in it, and to not do anything from it, I think, is also not really a best practice. But to maybe do everything is not really likely at this point either. I'm wondering, would it be considered a friendly amendment to say that staff by the end of the calendar year get us a report that takes care of sort of incorporating some of Melinda's suggestions in a housekeeping document by year's end for changes to the code of conduct? This is what I asked for last month or whenever this came, and I think that might be warranted. I don't know if that just needs to be direction to staff or if that has to be put as a friendly amendment or an amendment to Councillor Wheat's motion. I guess we'd have to ask the clerk.
Do you have a quick comment, Councillor Bell?
Yes, I do. I'm supportive of what both Councillor Chambers and Councillor Ferrier have brought forward. So John Wheat's recommendation is good, but we need to move it on and come to a conclusion and decide whether we update our conflict of interest document and how we do it. The timeline is important. I think perhaps the end of the year is a little too far away, but there is perhaps a more pressing issue as well that I'm not quite sure when Melinda's contract actually runs out. So we need to deal with that as well. I would hope that when we get a report back from staff that would also be addressed. Thank you.
Joan?
Thank you, Chair McAlpine. The thing that I would suggest that we do was a suggestion from Melinda about adding a separate section on the county website with the process spelled out about code of conduct and complaints for the public. The public don't know where to go. And I think that was the point of doing that, so that it's easily accessible to the public, rather than them call a counselor and say, oh, I don't like what happened at that last meeting. So-and-so was not treated very well, or I didn't like what Joe Blow said at that meeting, and he should be called to account for that, whatever.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yep.
There is a motion on the floor and Councillor Goward is not speaking towards the motion. The motion was to receive, and there was a friendly amendment made. I think what Councillor Goward is talking about is the nitty-gritty of the recommendations.
This is added to the friendly amendment, Councillor Coleman. The friendly amendment was to bring forward recommendations, and this was one of the recommendations that was made, that we should have a separate section on our website. And I'm just,
I think, Joan,
that I would like
we'll
to
just
see.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Joan. Heather, so if I just asked John if he accepts that as a friendly amendment then?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, we
Okay.
have direction from the last meeting to go back with the integrity commissioner and bring forward a report with some of the recommendations. So we'll deal with the easy housekeeping amendments. Some of the more complicated ones, we may want to wait until we have the next contract for the next integrity commissioner. It may be something they want to weigh in on. And in terms of Joan's suggestion with the website, staff can just do that. That can just be direction to staff. We don't need a report or a motion specifically just to change the website.
Okay. Councillor Pierce?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, speaking to the motion, I'm in agreement with receiving it. But what I think we should do here, I'm in favor of allowing staff to go away and update the small amendments and stuff like that. But as Councillor Chambers said, at the end of the day, the judge, and I agree, should be the council. So what I would suggest is the ones that aren't so cut and dry is that we call a special meeting and we run through them. There might be a half a dozen of them, however many are not simple housekeeping changes, and we decide as a council whether we want to add those in or keep them off. I think that's got to be separated, but I agree with the recommendation. I agree with allowing staff to do that. And I agree with where Councillor Gatwood was going there, in the sense of that we do need to have this online on a website, but not until it is finalized and we've got our finished document. Thank you.
A question to Heather. Would it be reasonable to come back in, say, October and have a special meeting then for it, or what would you suggest?
The housekeeping piece is pretty straightforward. I mean, I can probably bring that back even in May if, Melinda and I can work through the basic ones. The question is, do you want to wait until we have the next integrity commissioner contract nailed down before we bring back another report on the more complicated issues? Another integrity commissioner may have some different thoughts, or it may be Melinda again, but I don't know if that's something council wants to maybe think about in that context.
Councillor Miller.
Well, speaking of that context, I mean, one of the recommendations was only have an integrity commissioner for 5 years, and I believe we've had Melinda for 5 years. I will speak to the motion. I'm in favor of obviously receiving it. I'm also in favor of letting staff delve a little more deeply into our code of conduct, simply because I think anything could be tightened up a little, and I think ours certainly could. I mean, tonight I would be prepared. I won't, but I mean, I would have been prepared to move a couple of those recommendations, specifically ones relating to the independence for the integrity commissioner. I thought those were good. I thought those were fair. And then there's others I wasn't so supportive of because I think they're a little confusing to A, counselors, and B, the public, but I'll leave that to staff's judgment on that when they bring it forward. And I also, speaking of referring to staff and tightening things up, I mean, I like what the integrity commissioner suggested around the role of mayor and the delegation of authority or procedure. I thought that was really good. There's a couple things there's a couple things I think should be looked at least so we're all on the same page, if nothing else. So those are why I support the amendment. I think, like I say, I think our procedural bylaws, our code of conduct could be tightened up a bit, and I think there's some good things in the suggestions that warrant further examination. So I'm definitely supportive of the motion with the amendment.
Joan? Councillor Gatward? Did you have a comment?
No.
Okay. Councillor Pierce?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, just speaking to the motion and the timelines, I'm thinking at this point in time, regardless of whether we have Melinda back or a different integrity commissioner or something like that, again, if in fact there is somebody different, they may have their insights on it as well, but that's not saying that they can't look at it after the fact either. So I would suggest that we have staff do the quick housekeepings as quickly as they can and bring it back and call a special meeting as quickly as we can. I don't think we need to wait till October to make decisions on this. Let's get it done. I agree with Councillor Miller. There's definitely some things in our code of conduct that we need to have tightened up. So let's get them tightened up. Thank you.
Okay. So Heather, you're thinking in May, you guys could come back with recommendations for a special meeting?
For sure for the housekeeping. Maybe June, depending on what Melinda's availability is to give some time to go through the other stuff. I'm not sure exactly how many of those are going to take a lot of delving into, but it may be May, maybe June.
Okay, so so we have a motion to, could you put together a motion for us, Heather, for that, incorporating the Councillor Bell and John Wheat's amendments?
Yep, the motion is that the Integrity Commissioner's presentation and report be received as information, and that staff proceed with a report addressing the housekeeping amendments and suggestions therein.
Okay. That's okay with you, Councillor Wheat?
Absolutely.
Okay, and was it seconded by Mark Laferriere, Councillor Laferriere?
No, I made the amendment.
He made the amendment.
Okay.
But I believe the seconder was Councillor Hayes.
Oh, okay. And Councillor Howells, is that acceptable? Okay. So we all in favor of the motion as amended? Okay, not in favor? Pass. Okay. Thank you very much, Melinda. Your time.
But the other thing I was asked to comment. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Melinda.
I was asked to provide some comments or some advice around Zoom meeting or online meeting guidance and emails. So I have some notes, but I thought I might quickly canvass the councillors for what was coming up for them to make sure that that I can respond, and then I'll provide you with my notes as well. And I can formalize that again into a formal kind of guidance document for you after the meeting, if you would like that.
Same comments from council? Councillor Wee?
Leave that to the commissioner and our clerk to decide.
Okay. We'll direct you to the staff to work on that then, Melinda.
Okay, so you don't need any comments from me now then. All right.
Oh, Joan?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know if Melinda's prepared to bring forward advice about email meetings and Zoom right now. I'm not sure how long her presentation is, Mr. Chair, but rather than wait till perhaps June, it could be timely to do it now. I don't know who asked for that, but certainly sometimes an email gets sent out to all of us, and then we have heard from other counselors that it's inappropriate to do that. So I think that if the information is available tonight and we don't have a long agenda, then why not hear it tonight, unless you want to wait till June?
Councillor Bailey? Or Mayor Bailey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think because we have briefed the Integrity Commissioner about the inquiries that we've had from the public as to who's responsible for facial expressions during a meeting and whether it falls on the lap of the mayor or whether it is something that's just uncontrollable when someone says something that's unusual or startling, and then you just react because that's what you do. If that's something she wants to comment on, I think it was kind of interesting that somebody thought enough about that to ask us. So if the Integrity Commissioner is prepared to speak to how she feels about facial expressions, I wouldn't mind hearing about it.
Well, Melinda, if you could comment, that would be appreciated then.
Sure. All right. Well, I just have a few notes. So on Zoom meeting, sort of etiquette in general, with respect to the code of conduct, because the procedural bylaw obviously still applies. And so in respect of what Mayor Bailey said, if someone is behaving inappropriately on Zoom, then a point of order can be raised in much the same way as if someone was behaving inappropriately in the chamber itself. This is the chamber. It just is a virtual version of the chamber. So, so my comments are simply, a Zoom council meeting is obviously still a council meeting, and all the procedural and legislative rules apply. The code of conduct would also apply to behavior conducted on Zoom meetings and committee meetings. And it remains the same. It's directing you to avoid conflicts of interest and forms of behavior that are inappropriate. But there are some unique elements of virtual meetings that might tempt you to do things that would be in a breach of the code of conduct by accident or just because the social cues are different. So these would be things that I would suggest you keep in mind. First of all, obviously people can see into your home or your office if you have your camera on and you don't have a background like I have or some of you have. So keep in mind what the camera can see and avoid showing anything that's inappropriate, naked family members or, inappropriate advertising or things that might cause members of the public to be distressed. Consider how you personally are dressed. It's a meeting and should be treated as a meeting. Consider who might walk into the meeting and be seen or hear what is being said. So this is a council meeting, and you wouldn't just have people randomly walking across the middle of the chamber. And so you shouldn't have people randomly walking across the middle of your Zoom meeting. And if the meeting is in camera, that means the door is shut. No one can hear you. Your family members can't hear you. Anyone else in your house can't hear you or participate or hear what anyone else is saying. So that is the same as any other in-camera meeting. And then also consider any other materials that might be visible should you have to share your screen or someone else is sharing their screen so that there's no confidential information being shared by accident. And I've even heard of an integrity commissioner by accident sharing confidential information because he didn't know how to share a screen properly. So those are things that is accidental ways you can find yourself in a problem. If you use a background to disguise your surroundings, keep in mind that pop culture references, they can be fun, but they can also be unprofessional. So do your constituents really need to think you're sitting on the bridge of the Enterprise? And, you know, similarly, if you're using a background that's got advertising or something on it and you're debating a topic in which that might be relevant, you know, you maybe create a, you know, you just create the impression for the public that might distress them. Chat rooms should usually be disabled, and I'd recommend that you do that because they can distract from the meeting and create the potential that part of the meeting is happening in the chat and part of it is happening in the actual meeting. And then finally, the last thing, and this is about that temptation that I mentioned, is you are at home, but you're not really at home. You know, in the meeting, you're in the meeting. And so those social cues where you would kick someone under the table, or you could, you know, you could kind of give somebody the, you know, knock it off kind of look is much harder to do. And the dirty looks or the looks of shock, as Councillor Bailey said, in a meeting where we're all together around the table, it's easier to brush that off or to sort of, you know, understand the context. But in a Zoom context, because you cannot look at all the faces at the same time, and because people can screen grab just that facial expression with no context for why it happened, then it's a little bit harder for it to kind of just roll as a part of an ordinary social context. So if you can, try not to make faces or roll your eyes, just as you would do in any other professional context. So that would be my recommendations around Zoom meetings is, and as I mentioned, I can just formalize that into a little piece of guidance for you to have, you know, to hand.
Thank you.
And I also have some similar notes on email if you would like that, or again, I could just you know, have something that forwarded to you.
If you want to quickly go over that as well, then.
Sure. All right. So I was asked to comment just on the possibility of email meetings. So as you all know, Section 239 of the Municipal Act governs that meetings must be in public. And they are defined in Section 238 as regular meetings where a quorum is present, and that word is the operative word, and members discuss or deal with a matter in a way that materially advances the business or the decision-making of the council. Now, where there's confusion, a little bit of confusion here, is historically, the Ombudsman of Ontario, who acts as a closed meeting commissioner for a number of municipalities, they historically found that there was such a thing as a serial email meeting. So if in the course of a series of emails between a group of councillors, a quorum came to some kind of a decision, or in fact, sometimes even voted, then that was considered a meeting and they would have found that to be an unlawful closed meeting. They have changed their position on that. And I think that's where people can get kind of confused. So since 2019, in a decision they made with respect to the city of Hamilton, the Ombudsman no longer considers those to be email exchanges to be meetings. So you can't actually advance the business of the municipality in that email because you're not allowed to vote because they're not a meeting. A meeting requires some kind of physical presence or a Zoom presence with the amendments that came as a response to COVID. However, they would still take the view that you should not be having a whole lot of your discussions in private email conversations because you are undermining the nature of the meetings as public. And what was going on in Hamilton in part was the discussion about whether they were going to appoint a replacement councillor or whether they were going to have a by-election. And there was discussions about the personal qualifications of individuals, and it became very kind of messy and awful. And even though it wasn't found to be an unlawful closed meeting, the Ombudsman was not happy about it. And what they said in their decision was, although emails and remote forms of communication are no longer subject to the open meeting rules, municipalities should continue to strive for transparency and openness regardless of the medium used to communicate. The open meeting rules exist to bolster the public's confidence in the integrity of local government and ensure that municipal power is exercised in a transparent and accountable manner. The spirit of the open meeting rules calls for discussions that advance council business or decision-making to take place in public and not over email out of the public eye. So that's the official rules. Email exchanges regardless of whether they're moving ahead, the business of the municipality can violate the code of conduct. So, don't be mean to each other in your emails to each other, or inappropriate, or to the members of the public, or to people who are emailing you. Those rules still apply. And then the final thing to keep in mind is that emails are susceptible to FOI or MFIPA requests and Integrity Commissioner investigation. So don't use email thinking that it's a way to keep things secret from me or from FOI. So those are my notes on email etiquette.
Do we have a motion to further her report?
I don't think we need a motion. I think
well, thanks very much. Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much again, Melinda, for your report. It's very much appreciated for all your insights. And I think then we can move on to 5.2. And we look forward to working with you in the future. Oh, Mayor Bailey.
Thank you very much.
I was just waving goodbye to her.
Good night, everyone.
Oh,
good night.
Okay. Good night. Okay. So 5.2, Daryl Cully and Gary Molesberger, Emergency Management and Training, Inc., Fire Master Plan. Heather, do we have a presentation? Here.
Yep, just one sec.
Hi, Daryl.
Greetings. Good evening. Unfortunately, Gary Mossberger is unable to join me tonight, but I do have a short presentation that we'll provide. I believe someone on your technical end will put the presentation up.
Yep, it's just coming. Just one sec.
Thank you. Great. So thank you. On behalf of Gary Mossberger, Lyle Kwan, Rick Monkman, Ashley Keenan, and myself, we're pleased to make this presentation of the Master Fire Plan project. Next slide, please. So a Master Fire Plan takes a look at where we are. How do we best serve the community with the fire services? And then how do we get to where we want to be over the next 10 years? Attached to this particular project, a community risk assessment was completed as a separate document, but also taking part of the community risk assessment, taking a look at the risks in the community and building them into the Master Fire Plan. Next slide, please. So the community risk assessment is a new provincial requirement. It's now required of all municipalities to complete. It takes a look at what the risks are in the community and what are some of those options that are available to reduce the risks. The community risk assessment itself, because it talks a lot about critical infrastructure and those types of things in the community, is typically not a public document. However, the details inside of it are used to help design the strategy when we're taking a look at the Master Fire Plan. Under legislation, the community risk assessment must be updated every 5 years. Next slide, please. So forming part of the Master Fire Plan, we took the community risk assessment. We did extensive community and stakeholder consultation, particularly with the firefighters. They had multiple opportunities. We did a survey with them, station discussions. We provided them a copy of the draft and took their input back in after having a video conference with them. We had a town hall meeting with them as well. We did one-on-one interviews with leadership as well as senior municipal staff and council members and various other stakeholders. Next slide, please. The Master Fire Plan is built on standards and performance measurements. So it's not something that we've just created, but it's something that there's a lot of background history and standards that we take a look at, best practices and guidelines as well. Next slide, please. So the previous slide and this one are just a sample of some of the standards and measurements we take a look at. It's very important to note that you know, the Ontario Fire Service Section 21 guidelines, those are the health and safety guidelines that drive health and safety in the fire service. And that includes things like presumptive illnesses, whether they be cancers, and now we're dealing with mental health components as well. Next slide, please. The Ontario Fire Marshal's Office uses the 3 lines of defense and when they're talking about fire service, fire protection for the communities. And so what they want to see in any community is, first of all, an education program. Let's educate the community so that we can prevent fires from starting in the first place, so that people understand their roles and their responsibilities. For example, landlords must know their responsibilities to their tenants and that sort of thing. So the whole basis of the 3 lines of defense starts with educating the public. The next line of defense is inspections and enforcement. This is where we're inspecting things like vulnerable occupancies, hospitals, long-term care facilities, group homes, that sort of thing. And they're then hopefully having a plan to extend that out into other types of businesses, whether they're commercial businesses, things like hotels, motels, restaurants, and different types of occupancies. So the inspection component, as well as an enforcement component. So where there's a failure to meet the standards and the owner is unwilling or does not upgrade or meet the standards that are required, and through education you can't convince them to do so, then there's an enforcement component. And the third line of defense, which is what we mostly think of when we think of fire services, is the emergency response. So really we want to build a holistic system that's built on a safe community through education, inspections and enforcement. And then if those fails, we have emergency response when an emergency occurs. Next slide, please. So a summary of some of the key findings in our master fire plan. You know, you have a community that has areas that are growing very rapidly. It's a very large county geographically with a mix from agricultural and rural areas to an urban mix with some heavy industry as well. So you've got some different dynamics taking place that a lot of communities are focused, you know, they're either rural or they're urban, but you've got this whole mix, and you've got specific areas within the community that are growing and changing. And your demographics are changing. For example, in the rural areas, you've got an aging population, and that has a different type of education, fire prevention education, than in the suburban areas where you've got a lot of new housing coming in and young families coming in. So your demographics are changing throughout the community itself. One of the things that's impacting fire services across Ontario is the increased legislative requirements and the demands. We're seeing, you know, I mentioned presumptive illnesses, whether that be cancer or mental health. So there's now a requirement for fire services to have a cancer prevention program and a mental health program. But there's also varying standards depending on the type of construction, and getting back to that community risk assessment, to the types of risks that are found in your community. Next slide, please. This map just gives you a coverage map of the county, showing where your current stations are. The dots are where calls are occurring, and the dots are color coded to the station that was the primary response to them. And we've used a 10-minute response time. So on a whole, the county under NFPA standards would be considered a rural community. In other words, the aim is to have fire apparatus on scene within 14 minutes of being paged out. So we've used a 10-minute response time on this particular map, allowing for 4 minutes for the firefighters to reach the station and head out. And as you can see, the vast majority of the county has very good coverage. And in some cases, there's overlapping coverage between stations, such as Station 2 at the airport. There's a lot of other stations in the area that also cover that particular station's area. Next slide, please. Ongoing with our findings, the county has been making significant progress and really needs to be applauded for the steps forward in replacing aging stations and bringing equipment up to standard. The county has really made some significant steps. There's a lot of growth, and that growth is really focused in the proximity of Paris and the Highway 403 corridor. And part of the challenges that we're finding or that have been identified is that Paris itself is experiencing increased traffic congestion, where some of the rural areas, the population's remaining fairly stable, but in some of the areas along the 403 and Paris, you're finding increased population as well as increased business and industry, which impacts the travel. Next slide, please. This slide is a slide that we use frequently just to identify how quickly fire grows, and that there's numerous components to a fire response. If we look towards the bottom, you'll see that, first of all, we have to detect the fire, right? So hopefully we have smoke detectors or a fire alarm system in place that's going to use heat detectors or smoke detectors in order to identify that there's a fire. There's the reporting of the fire, so the person actually calling 911. Then there's the dispatch of the apparatus or the firefighters to the call. Then there's the response to the call, and then the firefighters have to set up. So we take all of that time into consideration, when it gets to looking at the time required to fight a fire. And fire grows very quickly. It can double in size every 20 to 30 seconds. And so that has an exponential growth rate when we're talking about some of the new construction in new housing and wood stick construction that we're now seeing in some of these buildings that are now 4 or 5 stories tall. Next slide, please. This slide basically is telling us that, the fire service, and we all know this, the fire service does much more than just fires. Medical calls make up 42% of what's occurred in Brant County prior to COVID. Now that's going to be reduced somewhat during COVID as the tiered response protocols have changed a little bit. But we also have a number of other things here. We have rescues. We have public hazards, things like hydro lines down, fire alarm activations, carbon monoxide alarm calls, make up 4%. Burning, particularly in the rural areas. And so there's a number of types of responses that the firefighters have to be trained and capable of responding to. Next, please. So we take a look at all of what's going on. We take a look at the community risk assessments, the demographics, the growth, everything that's happening in the community, and we put together a series of recommendations. And there's two types of recommendations. There's strategic recommendations, and those strategic recommendations require council involvement. They require your approval and going forth. And then there's the operational recommendations, and those are the recommendations that are internal, that the fire chief and his team can address. And in many cases, as we were writing this study, many of the things have already been addressed, and some of those recommendations have already come off because the chief has been very focused in moving forward. So those are the internal. So we're going to take a look at all of the strategic recommendations, and then we're going to show you what some of the operational recommendations are. So next slide, please. So probably the biggest one, and the one that probably will cause most concern because it's an expensive recommendation and it's got an ongoing implementation, is that due to the growth in Paris, as well as the challenge of getting volunteer firefighters to be available Monday to Friday during the daytime, when they're often at work or out of town going to school, or that Monday to Friday day shift is a challenge in suburban areas across Ontario to get firefighters. So there's a number of ways of dealing with that. Some fire services jump and they want 4 firefighters on a truck right off the start, and usually would recommend hiring 5, which is what a career engine or pumper would be staffed with. We're suggesting that if you hire 3 firefighters to provide staffing Monday to Friday, with a minimum of 2 firefighters, they're going to be able to address many of the calls, like the medical calls and the carbon monoxide calls without symptoms, and things like that without calling the volunteers in. So it's going to take some of the pressure off the volunteers who are already responding to a very large number of calls, as well as improving the response time. And then, of course, obviously, if they're responding to an actual a fire or reported fire or an alarm, the volunteers will be joining them very quickly. So we're looking at it more as a phased in process as opposed to implementing a full career staffing right away, and doing it Monday to Friday, just during those hours where you're having challenges getting volunteers on site in a timely manner. The second recommendation is assign the position of duty officer throughout on-call coverage along with the fire chief and deputy chief. So right now, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the chief and the deputy chief one of them is always on call. And so we're saying, allow for them to be able to appoint a duty officer, someone who can help take that call as well as a third person. That's also career development, but it takes some of the pressure off them, particularly over vacation seasons and that sort of thing. So not much expense attached to that. It's just bringing someone else in to assist. Next slide, please. So right at the beginning, we talked about the importance of fire prevention, that education component, that inspection component, and the enforcement component. And so there's a number of factors involved, and there's a whole section in the report on fire prevention. And we're recommending that it's time to add an additional fire prevention officer, which is also a second title of a public fire life safety educator. There are 2 different educational standards for the position to assist in that public education. A couple of focuses can be on the rural area where the response times might be a little slower to ensure people know how to get out and they have home safety plans and that sort of thing, but also dealing with, you know, in the community, vulnerable occupancies and homes where there's a higher risk of vulnerability, such as people, seniors, children, persons with disabilities, that sort of thing. You've got a fire prevention department. We're saying take one of those people and promote them to be chief fire prevention officer, so that they don't have to report directly to the chief or deputy chief all the time. They would have a supervisor within that division. So it's not an additional position on top of the other one, but what we're saying is use one of those people that you've got, create that supervisory position so that that division, fire prevention, can operate more smoothly without direct chief and deputy chief involvement every day. Training. As many of you have heard, the Ontario Fire Marshal is out closing the provincial fire college in Gravenhurst. But there's a lot of, that's still a long ways away and logistically challenging. There's a lot of training that can be done close to home. A mobile training unit would allow it to go from station to station, keep your firefighters within the community and let you provide them the highest quality of training to them. You know, and you could even rent it, for example, to the city of Brantford, which does not have any, you know, live fire training capabilities themselves. So it also could be used for communities outside of the county to help cover the cost. So that's a midterm as you grow your training program. Next slide, please. Hiring a training officer. You have over 100 firefighters. That's a lot of training that needs to be done. Training reduces risks of injury. It reduces liabilities. It really needs to be coordinated. Right now, training falls to one person in a lot of the different stations, and then that is all compiled with the deputy chief. Having someone who can coordinate all of that training and those training programs, and they're evolving all the time. You know, we're now having to do training on electric vehicles and you know, solar power on people's homes, and the whole firefighting environment's changing all of the time, and that really requires someone to keep on top of the training needs, keep developing new training programs, and ensuring that all of your firefighters are meeting the competencies that is required of them. And looking out further, as the community continues to grow, you know, there may need to be a need for a part-time training officer in the future in order to assist in keeping up with all of that, particularly if you now have a mobile training unit where you're able to do a lot of that training yourselves. The next recommendation involves dispatch. Dispatch is evolving very quickly. Next generation 911 is causing, you know, a lot of that evolving. And what we're suggesting is that there may be more economical ways of doing it than the current method, but also ways of maintaining the highest quality of standard. So what we're finding is a lot of the smaller dispatch centers are having to either move to a larger center or amalgamate. And so what we're suggesting is sending a request for information, not making a a commitment with a request for proposal, but sending a request for information to the several fire dispatch centers across the province that contract out to other areas, look at their capabilities, their pricing, and how they can meet your needs for the future. And then that'll give you some options in where to take your communication center in the future. Next slide, please. Paris, again, is growing. And so we're suggesting a satellite station on the north end of Paris. Traditionally, we've always looked at building stations, and nowadays there's multiple options, leasing. We're finding fire department, City of Barrie, for example, leased a commercial unit in a commercial complex. So they didn't have to put in the money to actually build the station. But so either look at constructing or leasing a station in the north part of Paris, staffing it with one truck, a pumper with a large tanker capacity, and putting firefighters in there to help cover off that development in the north end of Paris and some of the area north of the city that currently is out of that typical response range from the current station. Long term, so we're looking, 7 to 10 years out from now. You're with the advent of a station in the north, creating a new headquarters station somewhere in the vicinity of Rest Acres Road and Highway 403, and amalgamating stations 1 and 2. Again, station 2 has good coverage from a number of stations currently. It would even be better with a relocated station 1. That station 2, not a lot of calls, fewer firefighters at that station. Being able to combine that is going to give you, bring those firefighters together, give you a better response capability, and reduce the factor of having to replace that station in the future as well. Next page, please. As you've been upgrading your stations and building new stations, you're putting exhaust systems in them. There's going to be a few stations. There's 3 stations that don't have them. That's part of the cancer reduction program. So we're recommending those 3 stations have exhaust extraction systems put in. Station in Burford, the asphalt needs to be replaced. And there are 3 stations, or there will be, once you've got some current construction going on, that will not have backup generators. And in long-term, power failures, the community often sees the fire station as a community refuge, particularly if they've got medical problems that requires ongoing power or that sort of thing, as well as allowing the firefighters to operate more smoothly in a long-term power failure like an ice storm or a severe summer storm. So there's 3 stations that require backup generators. Next slide, please. Bunker storage gear, bunker gear storage. This is the ensemble the firefighters wear. It becomes contaminated in fires. Even washing it, it's still, they've been proven to still have toxins on them. We know cancer is now the #1 risk to firefighters. And so the standard now is to move that gear away from the apparatus, put it in its own room that's ventilated in order to keep the fumes down and to keep it from being exposed to fumes from the apparatus. So there's a few stations where that needs to be reviewed. The next one is review the potential of sharing mechanical services or contracting with the county operations for mechanical services. You know, in order, right now, it's all contracted out to private vendors. But this would allow, you know, your county staff to get an expertise on some of the apparatus and that sort of thing, and bring things in-house. The next recommendation is, you know, the County of Brant and 6 Nations of the Grand River develop a fire services agreement, including cost recovery mechanisms for assistance provided. So right now, the county has been providing from time to time some significant hours and standby for the First Nation. And what we're saying is negotiate an agreement where your costs are being covered for that assistance. Next slide, please. So just some of the operational recommendations that you'll find throughout the throughout the report, things like update the establishing and regulating bylaws. So having the fire chief just take a look at that and monitoring it on a regular basis, an annual basis, to see if there's any changes that need to be addressed. Monitoring and evaluating call statistics, because they are changing. You know, they're changing because of COVID. There's so many different factors that can cause change. So monitoring them, and because some of these recommendations, depending on, you know, whether the call volumes or the growth of the community increases or slows down, that's going to have a factor on things. Update the tanker shuttle accreditation. You know, that provides savings to the homeowners in the rural part of the community that don't have hydrant in the water. Succession planning. So those are just some examples of some of the operational recommendations. Next slide, please. So that's the end of my presentation. Mr. Mayor, I'll turn it over to you.
So do we have some questions for the presenter? Councillor Howes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to the consultant. First of all, thank you for the very thorough presentation, and we appreciate your expertise in these matters. I have a couple comments and a question. I guess the comment relates to I think most residents would be surprised to find out we have 182 volunteer firefighters. So that's just that alone is something people need to be aware of. And specifically, I like the recommendation about the full-time training officer. I think that's something that's been in our plans before. And I guess my comment is I hope that happens on the sooner end of the spectrum rather than the later end of the spectrum. And I was also pleased, and I think residents would be pleased to see the recommendation towards a North Paris fire station. That is a topic that comes up from residents. You acknowledged in your presentation about the fact that we have some traffic issues. Those traffic issues are going to get worse before they get better, because we are at some point going to be tearing up our downtown for our downtown master plan. There's infrastructure that needs to be improved there, and we're going to be doing an overhaul of Grand River Street North, which is essentially the main artery through Paris. My question is, in your timeline for 4 to 6 years for that North Paris station, did you give consideration to the fact that some of our main roads are going to be torn up in the very next few years? And I'm just wondering if they're within your recommendations, if there's consideration for that, if temporary measures need to be taken to make sure that our firefighters can get through Paris when they need.
Well, certainly we looked at population growth, not necessarily, you know, the construction on the major arteries you're talking about. The the option we talked about, leasing, allows you to be very flexible, and even evaluate in the long run, after that construction's over, how effective was that? And so it allows you to evaluate that. But I would certainly recommend that if that is you're going to have those major disruptions, that at least you have some resources, because you do have a significant growth in the north end of the town.
Okay, thank you. I do know that residents already ask and express concern about fire trucks being able to get through Paris at critical times. And if we have construction in those main areas, I'll trust that our officials our fire official staff will take the appropriate measures. Thank you.
Councillor Pierce.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Daryl. Yeah, again, thank you very much for this report. It's long overdue. I think there's a lot of things in here that are, to be quite frank, a little embarrassing that we haven't done already for our firefighters, especially when a lot of it is to do around safety and that sort of thing. A couple of questions I have. On page 48 of our report here in the findings, you talked about increased legislative requirements and demands. I'm just curious, when that statement was made, was there anything specific that jumped out that was restricting us as a county fire department?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So there were a number of pieces of legislation that are changing, that are requiring additional demands. I don't want to say that they're restricting you, but already talked about the requirement to have a cancer prevention program, to have a mental health program. Some of the other things are like the community risk assessment. So, we assisted in completing that this time, but it is a very significant time-consuming project. And so it's typically done by your fire prevention program. If you've already got a very tight fire prevention program that's at their limit, then turning to them and saying, we now have, you're now responsible for updating the community risk assessment on an ongoing basis. Those are additional legislative demands that they're going to face. The other thing that we are anticipating, the province came out with requiring a certification of different levels of positions within the fire service, and then they've backed out of that a little bit. But we anticipate that you're going to see those certifications come back. So those are the types of legislation, as well as the increased reporting requirements that the province keeps adding to your administration, your chief, your and support staff. The province is always demanding more and more reports.
Okay, thank you for that. On page, just to go a little further, on page 56, when you talk about the moving forward with the strategic, at the bottom you talk a request for information for fire dispatch centers to look at capabilities, pricing, etc. Are you is this talking specifically about the dispatching end of things, or is it talking about the system that does the dispatching, the radios and such? Because I know we've just put a fair chunk of money into that, to that end. I just want clarification. Is that the dispatching itself or the tools used to dispatch?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is the dispatching itself, the staffing and the dispatch center. Your radio network, etc. It can be compatible. Most of them are very compatible with the different dispatch centers.
Okay, yeah, because I know we've done a lot of work on that lately. And one last one, Mr. Chair, if I could, on page, I believe it's page 67, the moving forward strategic again. When you talk about the potential of a headquarters headquarters station by the 403 and Rest Acres Road and potentially moving Station 2 into that. Would that affect I know you spoke earlier in the presentation about that 10-minute response time. So if we were to move Station 2 from its current location on Highway 53 to the 403, are the other stations, Burford, Scotland, and that sort of thing, are we still able to cover that 10-minute response time?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes. That our GIS system shows that station has overlapping coverage from multiple locations.
Right. Okay, thank you very much. Again, a fantastic report, and I've got some questions later on for the recommendation, but thank you very much.
Councillor Bell.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to delegation. On table 3 in the report, you pick out 6 or 7 different municipalities, and there's quite a contrast between the 2 at the bottom and the 6 above. What's the logic that Kawartha Lakes and Chatham-Kent have used to determine that it needs so many more full-time firefighters, and we, like many of our neighbours, have none at the moment?
Through you, Mr. Chair, Kawartha Lakes has the community of Lindsay, so it's almost like a Paris within Brant County, and so they have 1 truck that they staff with 4 firefighters. Actually, they staff with 4 firefighters, and they go to a minimum of 3, 24 hours a day in order to cover off that urban part of the community. And they also have volunteers working out of that station. And it's the same with Chatham-Kent. So Chatham-Kent has, it's what we would call a composite. They have stations with career firefighters that are supplemented by volunteers as well in their larger communities.
So just help me understand. I'm sorry, I'm maybe a very dumb question on my part, but why would they do that and we wouldn't? If you say Lindsay is very much like Paris.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's why we have a recommendation that you add career firefighters to the Paris station in order to cover those. And we're suggesting it in a time we're trying to be as economical to the community as possible in saying, your firefighters in the evenings and night times and weekends, you have very good availability. It's that Monday to Friday challenge. And so we're saying start there. Take a look at there. So if you look at, there's other departments like Whitchurch Stouffville, where they have 1 station with career firefighters being supplemented by volunteers 24 hours a day, but they've got another station which they just have career firefighters Monday to Friday at their second station, just to cover off those periods where volunteers are a challenge to get there, and they're also dealing with the increased traffic and that sort of thing.
And can you discern any difference in terms of overall result from the approach that Kawartha takes relative to what we have today? Recognizing you're suggesting we go in their direction. Are we really behind on this scale at the moment?
Through you, Mr. Chair, your volunteers are very dedicated and they're working hard. There comes a point when a station is doing so many calls that you start to see burnout. And considering that these firefighters have lives, they have jobs, they have families, they may be, doing education, they have all of this. And now we've added a high amount of training, significant training that we didn't have, 10 or 20 years ago. So we're asking them to put that time in as well. But then, we have this significant number of calls. So what they found in some of these other communities is, I was talking to a fire chief today. If a call comes in for a carbon monoxide alarm Monday to Friday, they don't get the same enthusiasm of the volunteers to respond to it, right? So sometimes they're sitting there not knowing if anyone's coming. Well, by having those career firefighters, they can deal with a lot of those, the medical calls and that sort of thing, without paging the volunteers. That reduces the pressure on them. It increases the response time because they're already there available to respond. And if you do get a structure fire, they're there quickly to, to start setting up the equipment as the volunteers arrive.
Just one final comment, if I may, Mr. Chair. I think it is a very, this is to me the most important of your recommendations, and I fully support it. I would even encourage that we move the timing forward. Thank you.
Councillor Gatward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to Daryl, I have several questions. The first one is about communications. And you noted in your survey comments from the firemen that there was frustration on their part. They would get to a medical call and the ambulance was already there. So is that a dispatch problem where dispatch knows there's an ambulance close to the call location, but they still dispatch both fire and ambulance? And I was alarmed to see that 43% of the calls are medical calls. And that's, they're very helpful in rural areas when an ambulance isn't nearby. But is that an issue in Paris in particular? Because, we're talking here about adding full-time firemen, but is it to do medical calls that maybe an ambulance station can handle? We have one at the Willett. I want you to comment on that. And also, how many times has there not been enough firemen in Paris to respond to a call?
In order, firefighters.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So there's quite a few questions here. So let me try to keep on top of each one of them. The tiered response agreements are between the Central Ambulance Communication Center and the fire service. And so it's the Central Ambulance Communication Center that determines whether or not they're going to notify the fire service based on a number of criteria. Some communication centers, they have implemented what they call spontaneous or simultaneous dispatch, which means the fire department is notified at the same time that the paramedics are notified. There's been a push to try to get the province to implement that province-wide. So often what happens now is the communication center will, or the Central Ambulance Communication Center will identify when they'll send the ambulance, then they'll try to assess whether or not they need the fire department. And sometimes that takes a little bit of time, and sometimes there's a delay in notifying the fire department. And yes, sometimes there is a communications challenge from the Central Ambulance Communication Center to the fire dispatch. So there can be delays, and keeping in mind that at your volunteer stations, it takes time for the volunteers to get there, get on the truck, and then respond to the medical call. So sometimes that ambulance, depending on where it's coming from, has an impact there. So that's something that's not unusual in the province. It is something that every organization is trying to work through. The question about 43% of your fire calls being medical calls, that is not an unusual number. That is based on the tiered response criteria. Now we are seeing with COVID, some of the protocols being adjusted. So we're waiting to see what the research shows, whether or not, you know, having the fire department respond to fewer calls as they have with COVID has provided the same level of care for the patients or address the patient's needs adequately. So those are going to be some, I know there's some research going on about that and trying to determine what the right number of calls for a fire department to respond to is. You know, there are many calls, cardiac arrests, and different types of calls where the firefighters, even if the paramedics are there, the firefighters are extremely valuable in assisting the patients. And I'm sorry, ma'am, the last question you had.
Can anybody remember?
Wasn't it something with, sorry, Mr. Chair, through you, how many times we've been caught where there's somebody not, or where they're not available to go?
Yeah, that was it. Thank you, Councillor Pierce.
Through you, Mr. Chair. One of the things we identified in the operational recommendations and that the fire chief has already started to work on, but was a lack of good data for us to analyze things like that. And some of that has to do with what's occurring at the dispatch center. Being able to calculate and have the right software to be able to calculate that on an ongoing basis. So we have, you know, we have enough data to show Monday to Friday is a challenge. We don't have a lot of data to show how ongoing that is at, you know, your other stations, right? So one of the operational recommendations is that there needs to be some better data monitoring, but that's going to require some software and some staff time to compile that information.
Mm-hmm. And I was surprised to read, Daryl, in your report about asking for information from other dispatch centers. At one point, we were dispatching for another nearby community, as well as ourselves. And when we moved our dispatch to the new OPP detachment, we expanded their space and equipment so that they could, and that the county could bid on other dispatch for other communities. So when I read your report, I was confused. I thought, are you suggesting we go out and get other communities, or that we go to other communities because you didn't feel our dispatch was adequate? And I guess I got my answer during your presentation, and one of the questions asked earlier by one of the other councillors, but I wanted you to also touch on, Mr. Chair, a comment that Councillor Pierce made, because it's very important. Recommendation number 30 in your report is very concerning to me. The reason being, if you close the current Paris location on Dundas Street West, and you close the airport, both of those areas where those fire stations are located have industrial areas and commercial in Paris, and airport has a large residential area to the east of the airport, which is growing. There's going to be 80 new homes built there in the next couple of years. And when I looked at the response times, which you didn't mention tonight in your reporting, other than that we have to be there in 10 to 14 minutes, I was taken aback because the response times to go to the industrial area in Paris from the 403 is going to increase by at least 6 or 7 minutes. And the same with the airport station. The response time is going to increase because of the travel distance. Not to mention the additional travel time for the firefighters to get to that 403 location, to get on the truck and go back to where they came from. So I think the former Paris councillors chose that location on Dundas Street because there was 2 routes that they could get downtown in a couple minutes. And downtown is also a big risk because the buildings are all connected. And are we willing to take that risk and close that fire station that's so close to the downtown and put it 7 minutes further away? In your chart, you mentioned fire doubles in size every 30 seconds or every minute. And I have a big concern with that. I certainly favor the North End fire station in Paris. We talked about that when we did the 2007 Maiden Brandt Master Fire Plan. We talked about needing that in the future. And I agree with that. And I think a leasing option is a great idea. But I don't think it's a great idea to increase response times to 2 industrial areas. We're trying to grow the airport industrial area because we made a deal with the city for servicing during the boundary.
Point of order. Is this discussion or questions to the presenter?
Well, it's
Point of order to the chair. Point of order to the chair, not to the speaker.
It's a question. I just haven't got it out yet.
Okay, can you get to the question quick?
Sure. Okay. In your recommendation about combining the 2 fire halls, did you consider the high-risk industrial areas in both communities? And did you consider the additional response times, whether that would still meet accreditation for the tanker shuttle? And did you consider the growth that's going to happen in the airport area? And did you consider the airport fire service for the actual airport?
Yeah.
Sorry, there's so many questions. This is a huge report.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we considered all of that. We also looked at where the new development is going, where you have approved development versus planned development. And that's why when we look at this, we look at it as a strategy, i.e. the station in the north prior to moving. And you know, we did the mapping models, and I guess the short answer is yes, we did consider all of that before we made that recommendation.
we have any more questions for the presenter? Councillor Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Chambers.
Okay, a couple of questions. I will just say I enjoyed reading the report because I learned things that I simply didn't know before, and I think that's great. My first question to the presenter was the only thing I would have liked to have seen in the report is maybe some kind of ranking system. I'm clearly not an expert in fire safety, any of that, but I am an expert in listening to my constituents and them talk about taxes and all that stuff. So having said that, is everything there got the same ranking as in your opinion regarding the importance of getting done? In other words, I think everything in the report is probably we should do it, but is there some things we should do versus things we must do? I guess anything we must do, I guess, would be legislative related, but at the same time, well, I think you know what I'm asking. Is there any way we can weigh them and go from there? That's my first question.
Through you, Mr. Chair. That question, for me to adequately answer it, would require, sitting down with the fire chief and saying, at this particular moment, because things are changing. Things when we started the plan was December of 2019. It's hard to believe. About 16 months ago. The changes with COVID, for example, are things that we're still trying to understand what the implications are. So, for example, if COVID continues to decrease the number of medical calls, that may allow you to delay some of the recommendations, i.e. hiring, etc. if the call volumes are dropping. If so some of them need to be continually monitored. Some of the urgent areas, certainly in our perspective, fire prevention is high on that list. The training officer is got to be high on that list. And I would say the north end fire station, it would be something I wouldn't be thinking as an optional item. I think that's something that the municipality needs to move ahead with. Budget wise, there are many of these that are actually smaller budget items, in the scheme of things. Fixing an asphalt driveway is probably not on a priority list. However, it's a small item. Can it be taken off the list easily? That's also another type of thing to be evaluated. And as Paris grows, and hearing from the other councillor, all these additional industrial complexes and whatever you're planning for, that all leads back to the having full-time firefighters to assist you with that as well. So, some of it's dependent on council's decisions and how fast, or also how fast the development actually occurs. So I had mentioned earlier, there's approved development versus planned development. So planned development, I've seen a lot of plans for industrial sectors that have been 10 years old and there hasn't been anything built. So that you need to be monitoring that all the time. Where on the other hand, a developer shows up and says, I want to build 1,000 houses north of Paris. That has an immediate impact type thing. So those all have to be weighed, and it would be unfair for me to give you absolute list without, the fire chief and his team also being involved in that discussion.
Yeah, no, fair enough. But like I say, I would have liked to see it, but I think, yeah, that's maybe more of a staff thing. Second of my third questions, the fire prevention officer, you mentioned that in your first response to my question. I believe we got 3 now, and you're suggesting we need a 4th. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I wasn't the only one working on this project, but yes, you do need an additional position. Keeping in mind, all of the roles that your fire prevention do, they review building plans and subdivision plans and new industry plans and that sort of thing. They're responsible for the public education programs and the smoke alarm program, which is mandated. The number of inspections that they do, for example, there's all the vulnerable occupancies. How many restaurants do you have in the community? How many hotels, motels? And as you build more, all of those types of things have to be inspected on a regular basis to ensure, the safety of the community. And so as the community grows, that is really where you want to start. Investing in fire prevention is going to save you in the fire fighting and the fire suppression end of things in the long run.
Okay, thank you. No, it's just, to me, I don't know. If you'd asked me 2 days ago before I read the report what I thought of that, I said, well, we got 3. I think that should cover it, but I'll leave that up to those that know. And then my last question, I thought you laid out a really good case for maybe hiring on some full-time firefighters Monday to Friday. And again, if you'd asked me before I read the report, I'd say no way, no how. It's too expensive. But at the same time, I understand the need for it. I understand the positives. Are there any negatives associated with hiring full-time outside of the cost? And what I'm wondering, is there any that you're aware of, any conflict or morale issues with a full-time firefighter working alongside any, say, volunteer firefighters?
Through you, Mr. Chair, it varies between departments, and it has a lot to do with how it's integrated, as well as the leadership in the process. So in some communities, the volunteers and the career firefighters are like oil and water. In other communities, they work together so well that you wouldn't know that there was any difference. It does happen, and it can happen, but it doesn't have to happen. And it's not something that I would say happens all the time. It's probably 50-50 on how it works. And a lot of that has to do with, the people and the personalities involved in the leadership. And with a lower number of volunteers, where we find sometimes that those challenges occur is, if you had, a lower number of career firefighters, if you had 20 career firefighters and 10 volunteers, sometimes, but on the other hand, one of our clients, the city of Collingwood, or the town of Collingwood, they're mostly career firefighters. They have 10 volunteers. They got 26, I believe, full-time firefighters. And they get along extremely well. So it, probably you asked if there's any drawback, and the big drawback is the expense. And that's why we suggested you go with a smaller number to try to manage it. And I know we had that discussion quite in depth within our own company when we were writing that recommendation as to whether we recommend you start with 5 firefighters with a minimum complement of 4, Monday to Friday versus the smaller number. Because the unions, the fire unions, like to see 4 firefighters on every truck. That's their, their ultimate goal. But we're suggesting, here's a starting place that's manageable budget-wise in comparison.
Okay, well, I appreciate your candid answers, and if when we go for the full time, it sounds like there's a few landmines we're going to have to watch out for. So I really appreciate your answers. Thank you very much.
Councillor Chambers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know time is marching on, so I'll try to be brief. Just a couple questions. First, I have the map of the service areas in front of me. And one of the problems that's always been in the westerly part of the county is the areas along 403 on the far west and the north section. There's agreements with Princeton Fire Service. And then again, on the southern end of the western side of the county, there's service agreements with Teeterville, I think it is, and perhaps Norwich. I'm just wondering if any thought was given in the master plan to those areas. And I know there's areas in the north, Glen Morris, those kind of areas as well. So has there been any thought with what I'll call blind spots in the county service?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we took a look at that, and I'm just trying to scroll through the report here quickly to get to the map that shows the number of calls as well. So some of these areas are very low call volume areas, so they're not very frequent. And having an agreement with your neighbors is very common on the outskirts of communities to assist. So, the short answer is yes, we looked at it, and we felt that some of those areas were being handled adequately now. Certainly the Northwest, with the highway running north, up out of Paris towards the Northwest, that area we identified as a concern, and having a station on the north side of Paris would dramatically assist that. It would provide coverage right up to the end of your municipal boundary on the Northwest.
And another question, if I might, Mr. Chairman, noting that 42% of the service calls are medical calls, I'm wondering if any thought and any time was spent on maybe synchronization between the paramedic service and the fire service with regarding medical calls.
Through you, Mr. Chair, was that it? If you're asking whether we considered it, yeah, absolutely. We talked to the paramedic chief in every one of these master fire plans we do, because it has a big impact on the fire service. There are alternatives to reduce the number of medical calls. That is, right now, I believe you respond after 10, if the ambulance is going to be longer than 10 minutes, you can always change that to, we won't respond until the ambulance is going to be longer than 15 minutes. But when you make those decisions, then the people in those rural areas that are most likely the ones to have those long times are going to have to understand that they may have a longer period of time before someone shows up at their door. As well, sometimes the paramedics, aren't in full control of where their resources are. It's the communication center that directs them. They may end up at a hospital and then redirected from there. So they're, as far as the paramedics are also, they also work on their own plans in order to try to get the resources back to their community and available in service in their own communities as much as possible, but that's not always within their control either.
Obviously, one of the problems in the rural areas, the further away you get from ambulance stations and fire stations, the wait times are longer. There's a relationship between the number of firefighters and the number of paramedic personnel and response time. And whenever we have the opportunity to increase staff, there's always a cost factor associated with that. But in order to save dollars on not hiring as many paramedics or ambulances that we argue about, or not hiring as many firefighters that we argue about, it's the rural areas in the remote areas of the county that suffer the most in terms of response times. So certainly the personnel recommendations are important for service to the extremities of the county, which sometimes we tend to forget. And I'm going to finish by a comment, Mr. Chairman, and that is I fully support the fire master plan. It's important to keep up to date. Not too long ago, and I can remember this, there was arguments about whether we should have medical response, firemen medically responding. There was some voices against that. I can remember there was voices against firemen carrying pagers. Councillor Wheat will remember that probably. The last thing I'll say is my early years on council, the dispatch system was the siren on the roof of the fire hall in Burford. So we come a long ways, but we still have to keep going and keep up to date, or we're going to get behind. We certainly don't want to be in a position where we have to rely on a dispatch system that is a siren on the top of the fire hall, which hasn't been that long ago. Those are my comments and questions, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Councillor Laferriere.
Thank you. Really quick, and thank you so much, Daryl, for the report. But would it be helpful if staff perhaps took some of the pieces around the medical calls and the information in your report and presented that to our paramedic services committee for us to discuss in that venue about how we might be able to best serve each other's interests in paramedic and fire and the county's interests more broadly?
Mr. Chair, through you, Mr. Chair, was that a question for myself or for the committee?
It was for you if you think that would be helpful to do. I see Councillor Chambers nodding, so I'll just maybe take that as enough of a yes. And as Chair of Paramedic Services, we can discuss some of that there and maybe call on you if we need to at the paramedic side to let our councillors from Brantford in on some of the information that we're getting as to how we can help each other.
Thank you.
A quick question, Joan?
Yeah, I just think that's a great idea what Mark just mentioned, but Councillor Chambers mentioned something that I forgot to ask about when he said about pagers. I read in the report that we're using emails now for letting the firefighters know about fires. Is that correct? Through you, Mr. Chair, to Daryl, is that what we're doing, is using emails instead of pagers now?
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, that's not correct. You use an app. There is a cell phone app that notifies the firefighter of the call. It provides them a mapping GPS of where the call is, and it allows them to hit a button on their screen and let the officers know that they're responding. And so it's not through email. It's through the cellular network. And it has many advantages in that it's two-way communications versus just a page out. Pagers are still very effective, but having immediate contact through this cell phone application is the benefit, but it is not through email.
Well, thank you for explaining that, because it mentioned emails in the survey comments, and that surprised me. So that's why I'm glad you've enlightened us. Thank you.
Any more questions? Okay, seeing none, do we have a motion to receive, or Councillor Leferrier, and seconded by Robert Chambers. Any questions, comments? All in favor?
Oh, I have a question.
Oh, yeah, Joan?
Before we vote on this, Mr. Chairman, I'm wondering about giving a blanket approval to 39 recommendations that extend 10 years into the future, because we're really approving.
Point of
things.
order, Mr. Chair. The motion is to receive the report.
Yeah. We're going to be talking further about this in a minute, Joan. So the motion's to receive. So
to receive the report, not what's in the recommendation.
The recommendation is another one, right. Councillor Chamber or Councillor Gatward.
Thank you, because okay, thank you. I thought we were approving the recommendation. Thank you for clarifying that.
Okay. So all in favor? Okay. Opposed, if any? Passed. Okay, consent items, there is none. And now we're on to the staff report. RPT 21-80 Fire Master Plan, Cindy Stevenson, G. Hyman, and L. Jackson.
Mr. Chair, you have some hands up.
Oh, Councillor Chambers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The recommendation on the agenda, it is in two parts. One was to be received, but I'm prepared at this time to move if you'd allow it. The second part of that recommendation, which is essentially referring it to staff. I'll read it for those of you that don't have it in front of you. And that the recommendations outlined in the master plan be brought forward to committee and council in the form of policies, business plans, and budgetary decisions as applicable and according to the timeline outlined in the master plan. I'm prepared to move that, because what that does, that puts it in staff's hands to bring forward the implementation plans, which can include the recommendations in the report, which can be decided upon in terms of budgetary decisions and the business plans, etc. So it's not approving and mandating them, it's moving them to the next step where they are put into practice. So I'm prepared to move that. If you
I would second that.
Second it.
Okay. Second by Councillor Pierce. And do we have some discussion on that?
Makes sense.
Okay. All in favor? We'll move to that. Okay. Opposed? And passed. So then we move on, I guess, to RPT 2193 Parks and Recreation Asset Naming Policy. Cindy Stevenson. Cindy, prepared to speak to that?
We'll move it first to get it on the floor.
Second.
Okay. Okay, moved by John Wheat, second by Councillor Miller. Cindy?
Good evening, Chair and members of Council. I think the report is fairly straightforward. The existing Parks and Recreation asset naming policy is quite out of date, and staff have worked on this to simplify the process, noting that we do have new engagement opportunities now with the public. So it has been updated to reflect that. And I'm happy to take any questions.
We have questions. Yeah. Do we have any questions? Steve, Councillor House.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Cindy. Great report. I think it's wonderful that we can use Engage Grant this way. My only quick comment or suggestion is, or I'll turn it into a question, is as we go through the process of as outlined, is there a way for us to post somewhere on the county website which assets have been assigned names that maybe aren't even executed yet? And I know it's not your department, but I would almost like to see the same thing for the street naming approach. We have a lot of residents who ask us about having assets named, parks named, etc., and streets, and in some cases some of the names that they're trying to get assigned have been assigned, but nobody knows because the asset hasn't been built yet or the street hasn't been constructed yet. So I just wondered, is there a way through the new process you're outlining for us to be more public about what's already been decided?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So this policy was just specific to the Parks and Recreation assets, which, I can advise we could certainly list them in one kind of central location if that is the wish of council. As far as the street names, I know there's a separate staff committee that's involved with that, so I'd have to.
Thank you.
Is there any further questions? So, Councillor Chambers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a comment in support of the policy and the recommendation. There may be times that come up that we're naming something. It makes such common sense and a good sense that this policy can be waived in a special circumstance. So it's nice to have a policy, but in some cases, things just seem to make sense, and it can save a lot of time and trouble if you just go ahead and do it. And there's nothing preventing that from happening. So that's why I support the policy.
Any further questions? Okay. There's a recommendation. Do we have somebody prepared to move it? Joan?
I had a question, Mr. Chair, with respect to the last comment that Councillor Chambers made. So if it's an obvious no-brainer, is that basically what you're saying, Councillor Chambers? An obvious no-brainer that we would name the Newport Bridge Coleman Bridge, for instance? Then we could do it without going through this process?
Yeah, I'm thinking through you, Mr. Chairman. I can recall naming the room at the administrative office, the warden's room. It was done simply by a resolution, and everybody thought it was a good idea, and it was just done. There may be something come up somewhere along the way. It might not be the Newport Bridge, might not call it the Coleman Bridge, but we might call Big Creek Bridge Chambers Bridge maybe. But some things are kind of obvious, and to go through a long rigmarole and process that the policy dictates may be just problematic, and it would be a common sense issue, and you could just move a resolution to waive the policy for such and such, and that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I remember the Mary
policies can get in the way sometimes if there's strict adherence and the abandonment of common sense and good practice prevail.
Yeah. Thank you. I remember the Mary Lowe's room. That was a great idea. So thank you.
Councillor Wheat, did you have a comment?
No, no. Just waving to the people on the street.
Okay. Oh.
Being friendly.
Okay, so we do have the recommendation. Do we have a motion to approve?
It's been moved and seconded, Mr. Chair, by Councillor Wheat, myself.
Okay. Okay, sorry. All in favor? Okay. Opposed, if any? Passed. Okay, we have no communications. Chief Administrative Officer's update.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening to members of committee. So I'll open my comments and just note to committee that this is the Policy Development Strategic Direction Committee. I think we've had some discussions in the past about what this committee was all about. I think tonight was a good example of that. These were policy matters, a new master plan for critical service, as well as a new policy. So this would be the flavor of the report types that we would be bringing to this committee going forward. Hopefully that makes sense to council. And I think we'll feel our way through this over the next few months and get a good feel for this committee structure. I just wanted to mention that our Emergency Operations Committee, or our Emergency Operations Center for the COVID-19 emergency did meet this morning on our weekly meeting. This was business cycle number 99. So we will be celebrating a big milestone next week. It's very concerning, I think, data coming around to the EOC this morning regarding the trajectory of COVID-19 in the community and in the province. Generally, we're holding on most things right now, any kind of reopening plans, any service resumptions, and just holding with our current plan, which we feel is working well as an organization. We'll continue to review things, and we are doing quite a bit of planning for the resumption of services, especially recreational programs in the summertime. But right now we're holding on any presumptive dates on that. So I'll just mention that Administration and Operations Committee is next week. There are a couple of big reports coming to that. The one, Robin has a report on automated speed enforcement, which will seek your approval to give me delegation to enter into a number of agreements that we're going to have to enter into to make that a reality in our community as well. And I think it was mentioned a little earlier, but a report will be provided to you on parking and new launch or river launch sites that was requested last month. A lot of people have worked on this. It will be a big report and a complex one, but I think we can at least achieve a few things this year. And I'll wait for that report to be presented next week. And again, I believe I think staff have done a good job of trying to get an approach for that subject. There was a little bit of discussion before the meeting that I heard, and I'll mention it. The senior management team will be putting its head towards what our post-COVID-19 workplace looks like. Now, some of our workplace really haven't changed that much. Certainly the field services and frontline workplaces, they've continued just with a lot of social distancing and public health inputs to stay safe. But a chunk of our workplace has also moved to a virtual environment. And I think it was noted by some council members earlier in some conversation before the meeting started. And it's being talked about at the staff level too, that we're probably not going to go back to the way it was. We're going to go back to something different. I'm hesitant to really make any decisions on this now, because I don't think we're sure when COVID-19 is going to be over. And we're not sure what the public health directions are going to be about the workplace in a post-COVID landscape. So I think making that decision too early will be a mistake. We could spend a lot of time trying to figure out what our workplace looks like, and to find out that we've got rules that won't make that work. So, but we are going to give that some thought. I had a good discussion about that with the corporate services management team. I'm acting general manager for that team right now, and we had some good discussion about that. So at some point we'll be bringing a recommendation forward to council on what we believe our post-COVID workplace looks like, whether it will result in more facilities or fewer facilities, and we'll be asking you to approve that. And I think it'll be a good discussion. So I also wanted to just mention that we we are putting some thought as staff to the development of a diversity, inclusion, and equity plan for the municipality. A lot of municipalities are working on similar plans right now, and I believe we should do the same. So we'll bring a framework of that plan to you once we've got a sense of how we would go about it, whether we can deal with it in-house or whether we'll need some external help on that. But I think it's something that we should be putting our minds to, and I hope council agrees with that. But noting you will have a chance to review whatever we come up with in that, hopefully in the near future. So I've got a couple staff members giving that some thought right now. And the last thing I wanted to mention, I met with staff yesterday on the official plan process, which is going well. We've had some hurdles, most notably, we had a big shutdown period in the early days of COVID. So we lost some momentum that I think we've regained. There is a special meeting planned for next week for the employment land needs study portion of that official plan. And what I've asked staff to do as well is at the beginning of that meeting to show council a flow chart of the entire process, because it's a big process and it's a long one. And I think that would help council to appreciate where we've been and where we're going on that. Because I think the last meeting, which was a great meeting, I thought there was great input about the residential land needs study, but there was a bit of confusion, and I appreciate that we weren't sure where we were in the process. So I've asked staff to clean that up and make sure that council fully understands, and for staff's purpose too, where we are in the process, what we've been through, where we are, and what's to come. And there's lots of life left in that process. We have a deadline of early next year to fully complete it and get it to the province, and we believe we're still on track for that. So that's my update, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the indulgence, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Do we have any questions? Okay. Well, thanks very much for your update, Mike. And do we have any other business, Heather?
I don't have any unless members of council would like to.
Okay. Seeing no other business. I don't believe we have any in camera either.
Nope.
Okay. So motion to adjourn.
Do it yourself, Mr. Chair.
Moved by Councillor House. John?